So are there any questions from the audience?
Do you find that the experience of reading is different when you're reading for translation? Or do you think the reading and the translation are two sort of separate, distinct operations?
Okay, and whoever wants to speak.
You mean reading as an editor?
No, reading as a translator versus reading as another hat.
I want to say that if you've translated for a lot of years, it's hard to read any way other than as a translator if you're reading from the language you translate with. And so like the margins of all the books that I read for pleasure supposedly are scrawled with little like notes on what this and that could sound like in English. It's an occupational hazard.
I don't think anybody really knows a text as well as a translator does, honestly. Very often better than the author. And so it must be a different kind of reading process. Yeah? If you're a professional translator, I'm sure that your experience as a reader is very different than a casual reader, if there is such a thing. Yeah.
Russ, how do you feel about,
Yeah, so I would say in a perfect world, I'd like to read a book, whether I'm editing the book or translating the book, to read it once before, sort of rolling up my sleeves and getting into it, because I think it's good to have that, to try to read as a reader with no other interest in the text than just to sort of absorb it. That's hard to do sometimes because you don't have that much time, or you think, I better write this down before so I don't forget it the second time around, but I think that's a good way to sort of be able to see the text both as how maybe you want, or how you think somebody else is going to see the text who's not in publishing, and then the second time around you really get your hands dirty.
I agree as an editor, yeah. Well said.
Yeah.
I have the same occupational hazard as Susan in terms of taking notes in the margins, but I actually sometimes translate blind also. I sometimes like to not read a book before I translate it, so maybe that might suggest that I do think I'll read it differently the second time or third time or whatever. So.
I hope this is okay as to ask, and if not, I'll ask a different question. I heard whispers that there was a passionate debate going on about the editing process in the galley, so maybe we can be included in that discussion.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I can articulate this succinctly enough for this sort of context, but I think that at Europa, and as a result, I, as an editor, we have an approach to editing translations that is that prizes faithfulness to the original, and I don't feel that we have a right, honestly, or a mandate to do developmental editing, to change things. And I ask you perhaps to reflect on the possibility that a Moldavian editor at some point may consider that Marilyn Robinson's book or Philip Roth's or Harper Lee's book has some problems, and they want to change parts of it because it would work better in their market. And if we consider that, I think sort of it becomes clearer that this may not be the right approach to working on translations, or at least it's not our approach on working on translations. And I'm very curious about the issue. I do have strong feelings about most things, but in this case, for me it's still an open question about whether we ought to or whether we ought not to edit heavily translations. And I feel that our role as publisher is also to bring what, for want of a better word, our defects, or our I keep using the word here, rough edges. Yeah, there are rough edges. We know that there's a different editing tradition in Europe than there is here, and there certainly is a different creative writing tradition and workshopping tradition and agenting tradition, and all of those people here in the US are working on a manuscript. They're all perfecting it, they're all polishing it, and we know that in Europe and elsewhere outside of Europe that tradition does not exist, but perhaps our job as publishers is also to bring that fact into the forefront, to translate that that aspect of the whole publishing process as well. And you know, I gather that that's a fairly unpopular opinion here, and that's okay. And I think it also, you know, it goes back, Sal, and again, you know, I hate to go back to this old question, but for us at Europa, it goes back to the question of where in the process we're actually reading a book. We are reading books before we acquire them. And if we feel that it's a horribly defective or flawed text, then we're just not going to acquire it. I think in most cases here, the situation is similar, so I won't cast dispersions, but in many houses, publishing houses in America, editors are seeing the text that they have acquired for the first time when they read it in translation. And clearly there the temptation is to, you know, patch and change and do things. Yeah, so
I want to respond to you. I'm not going to take issue. You got some responses too. I'm not going to take issue with it specifically, but I'm going to say that I think that for us, for Open Letter, what we've always looked for is the book that we want to translate that has some unique styles, unique voice, unique thing to it. And oftentimes, I think what you're defining as like the rough edges, to me, are good because the way that an American editor, God, this is tricky, isn't it? A sort of like a heavy-handed American editor that wants to make things fit an American style, the Jonathan Franzen style of writing, the MFA style of writing. We'll get this like, I had to work it in there, man. J. Franz has to come up in everything I do. It's like my arch nemesis of writing. Like that sort of like the rough edge part of it is sort of representative of a different type of style. And if you're a heavy-handed editor trying to fit that book into an American way of writing, an MFA style, which, okay, you know, whatever, painting with a broad brush here, but that sort of style of like neo-realistic American writing, and that those things need to be changed because they don't fit what we as Americans want to read. That's I have a huge problem with.
And none of the people up here
do this, right? Yeah, I'm saying that too, but like that's where the sense that I agree with what you're saying is that those rough edges are what make that book interesting. At the same time, we have authors like Dubravka Ugreshek who writes her books are different in every single language that she publishes them in, and she's explicitly involved in that process where she wants to reorganize essays, she cuts things, she changes things, she writes new things that are funnier jokes. She's constantly reworking because there is no solid, singular, first and only text. Like these texts are constantly being revised from start to finish, so there's not one that you can go back to and say like, this is the one that will appear in all languages as the text.
But that's a very
and so she
specific,
undercuts that.
Specific and unique artistic vision of her text.
I think that that's true. I think that you could expand that a bit into a lot of texts that exist, that there isn't one fundamental, there are drafts of everything. There are ways in which this book is never completely finished. And if you start to get in the philosophy of that, it starts to make it a little bit trickier as to when the editing process stops exactly.
We have some mic time down here.
Yeah.
You first, then me.
The writers that you mentioned, Michael Philip Roth and Marilyn Robinson, these are people who are at the peak of their career or who are very established writers. Sometimes we're editing writers who are, it's their first time novel. And we're not looking for books that we can get our hands on and rework, but sometimes it can be improved upon by sometimes light, sometimes slightly heavier cutting. And what we're seeing also is a version that has some degree of editing in its original form. So we're just trying to bring the best book, not necessarily for market purposes or to try and reshape it purely for an American perspective, but that we can bring the writing in its very best form.
Y'all editors have opinions about this. Wow. I just want to say from the translator's point of view, two things. Number one, I've observed very often that in the cases when writers translate their own books, for example, you know, I was just moderating on a panel, Sinan Antoun, who's a wonderful, wonderful Iraqi-born writer who lives here, teaches at NYU, and his new book, The Corpse Washer, which came out with Yale, he himself did the translation, and at the beginning he's got a little note that's the warning that anyone who wants to compare this, his English translation to the Arabic, he changed a lot. He changed things. He revised his book a little bit while doing that. And as a writer, of course, he has really the prerogative to do whatever he wants with the book because he's the author. So I'm just noting that this does tend to happen. Yoko Tawada does the same thing. She, her new book, which I'm going to translate, what's it called? Studies in Snow, Etüden im Schnee is the German translation. She wrote originally in Japanese and made a German version that she said she wants the German version translated rather than the Japanese original, which is its own complicated thing. But I just want to say as a translator, there is no such thing as a literal and exact translation anyway. That does not exist. The only way to have a real literal translation is to keep every word in the original language, because even the word bread means something different in English than it does in French, or, you know, everything is a little different. And this notion that you can just leave things as they are, I think is an illusion.
Going back to what Chad was saying about the Americanization of the text, I think if an editor is doing that, or that's the attempt, then there's something wrong in the process. I mean, you should want to maintain the voice of the original and be as true to that flavor as possible. Otherwise, you may as well write the book yourself. So, I mean, I think in that respect, yeah, you don't want to tamper with that, you know, at all. But everything needs work, and I think the reworking of the original, if you have access to both the translator and the author, which hopefully the translator does if they're not posthumously doing it, you know, then I don't think there is a, yeah, exactly, yeah. I don't think there's a massive issue with maybe going back to the author and saying, what would you think about this? And then they have veto power, you know, they can just say, no, I want my original the way it is, or...
Actually, Monique, do you want to talk about this at all? Like, did you, when you're... You don't have to, but when your books were translated, did you reconsider things? Did you sort of suggest other possibilities, or?
Well, first I have to say that there were some translators whom I had a lot of contact with, lots of back and forth, and I love that process. And there were some I've never heard from. And I will take it on faith that what they did was beautiful and appropriate. The kind of questions I've had have not been so much about reconsidering sort of maybe sort of the flow of a particular, you know, narrative, or like, you know, it's not a massive substantive things. It's more word choices. But I have to say, I was just thinking as I was sitting here, and you must have intuited, because now I have the microphone, that I just was working with my Turkish translator. And there was this just very funny moment where this was for my first novel, and it was one of the nicknames that I think it was Gertrude Stein's nickname for Toklas, or vice versa. It's been so long now. But the nickname was Pussy. And that has a very fun connotation in English, right? So, and also sexual. But the word that she thought it should be, that it should be in English was absolutely the worst possible word for a woman's nether region. And I was so amazed that that could have been it, you know, that if she had not you know, emailed me, and we had this very awkward email conversation back and forth about, you know, what pussy could mean. I'm so sorry to say this so loudly everywhere now, but I mean, I thought that was really like a fascinating little sort of moment where it could have gone terribly wrong. And I was so glad I was there for her. So did that answer anyone's question? I hope so.
Since you're all translating into English, I was wondering if that makes it, I mean, most of the authors probably speak English, at least to some degree. Is that more difficult or is that easier for you, since the authors might actually read your translations afterwards? How's the feedback? Do you sometimes wish you would translate into a language that they had no idea about?
Yeah. It's a mixed blessing, because it means that you, in many cases, can get your author's help. You could say, okay, so there's no exact equivalent for this thing you did, and it could go in this direction and this direction, and it could look in English like this, or it could look like this. Does one of these things feel like a better direction to you? You could have a conversation with the author, and that is completely helpful and great, and I do this all the time when I'm translating. On the other hand, you get sometimes, particularly in the case of authors who are being translated for the first time and have never experienced the necessary alienation of seeing your text in a different language for the first time, the sort of panicked, wait a minute, it's different. And that creates real discomfort. Like I remember having to have the conversation with a German language author. Why did you translate my word house as building when English contains the perfectly good house? And then I'm explaining, okay, because your house is 60 stories tall and made of glass and steel. Because so it's in the worst case scenario, it turns into the author not trusting you, and you have to explain English to the author. And in the best case scenario, it really is a collaboration. Jenny Erpenbeck and I email back and forth about things all the time, and her English is not entirely fluent, but it's strong, and she helps a lot with the translations.
It's funny to hear you say that the best case scenario is a collaboration, because for me that's the absolute worst case scenario. I want to deal with my authors as little as possible. And almost all of them speak great German. One, in fact, was bilingual, but she was fortunately extremely disinterested in the process. And she, by the way, had about probably 1,000 pussies and 2 very carefully chosen cunts in her book.
This has got to be Charlotte Roche. Ross, have you worked with authors who also speak English as well?
I pulled out of a project once because I was translating this. It was a nonfiction book written by one of the directors of the Moscow Yiddish Theater, and it was a really fabulous book, and it was incredibly interesting, and I was very excited to work on the project. But his daughter was handling it, and she's a Russian who'd moved to Israel, who speaks pretty decent English, but when I sent her a couple pages of the translation, there was about every 2 lines, in a very sort of Israeli way, why did you choose this word? I think this word might work. My dad meant this. So it was sort of doubly dangerous, because she was close to the text. It was her father, and it was this sort of sacred thing. He'd been killed by Stalin, and also she just thought she knew everything about the English language, and she didn't, because she spoke it as a 3rd language. And I said, I'm good luck, bye-bye.
I've observed with certain German authors, for example, Rilke, that over the course of the 20th century, there's been kind of an evolution or a greater elegance in how to render a lot of concepts from German. German can be a very complex language in the things that it can express. Do you perceive something similar in any of the authors you've worked with, or in your observation, that the technology of translation from German into English has evolved over time, has gotten better?
From the things I've read and talking to people, it does seem like the awareness of the complexities of translation has increased in translators as the century has progressed and as time has progressed, so that now it's much more, there's much more going into it. Like that there is an evolution of translation as a skill and as a concept and as a field of study and as all of the things that it is from like 1910 to 2015. So now things are more, there probably is more elegance, as you're saying, but also just because the translators are at a different point in like the world's history of ideas. If that makes sense.
I agree.
Thank you so much for coming. Please join me in thanking the panelists for their great job.